Thank you so much for having me. And I want to talk now about responsible tech in an era of hostile tech. And I realize the word hostile is a strong word, and so we'll get to that in a little while. But I want to start first with the question of, is technology good, bad, or neutral? Um, and there are lots of different perspectives on this. One of my favorites is this quote from William Gibson. I think that technologies are morally neutral until we apply them. It is only when we use them either for good or evil that they become good or evil. And I emphasize the word we in this quote because as technologists, we are the ones who are looking at these possible technological solutions and looking at a particular problem and saying, I now want to apply this particular technology in this particular situation. The next talks really about how innovations and technology interacts with the environment around us. And this quote from an author in the Financial Times: new inventions do not appear in isolation. They profoundly shape the societies around us. And I think we see evidence of that for both good and bad in many of the technologies that are rising today. But this one is particularly important for this talk. This comes from Mark Andreessen. The historical track record of technology innovators predicting the consequences of their innovations is very poor. So is everybody else's predictions. And so what this is telling us is that we are not really well placed to understand what are the impacts going to be from a particular innovation that we unleash to solve a problem. Now, there are three broad groups of people with their perspective on technology. And the first is the Tech Utopians. And many of these live in Silicon Valley in the US, or in the Boston area in the US, or in many of these technology capitals scattered across the world. And these are people who strongly believe that technology is the answer to society's problems. That we can come up with innovations that are going to solve all of the problems in the world: poverty, disease, oppression, injustice, all of these things we should be able to fix if we can just get the technology right. And then there are the tech dystopians, who believe that technology is always going to cause problems that we don't foresee, and that technology never has enough of a benefit to outweigh the costs to society. And very often those benefits, in their view, accrue to a group that already has all the benefits, and all of the costs are borne by others. And so that's a quite dim view of it. I don't believe in either one of those extremes. I am what I consider a tech pragmatist. I acknowledge and celebrate the power that technology has to address many of the world's problems, while recognizing, as Mark Andreessen pointed out, we're not very good at predicting all of the ways that these things can go wrong. And what kinds of ways can it go wrong? What are these issues that we have to come to grips with? And there are many of them. We hear an awful lot about bias, biased data sets. There are also, though, unintentionally biased algorithms. People use what they think is a good data set, not understanding the systemic pressures that created that particular data set. We have unintentionally biased goals. I hear people say, well, of course, my Facebook feed is completely objective because it's an algorithm. No, the person who wrote the algorithm to select that feed had a goal in mind, and that goal was to make money for Facebook. And that goal doesn't necessarily sound biased on the surface, but when you start to tease out what is actually coming from that data set, you begin to realize that yes, actually, this data set is biased. Ethics. We hear all kinds of questions around autonomous vehicles. Should a car protect the driver or a pedestrian if it detects a situation where it has no choice but to kill either the driver or the pedestrian? Of course, there's a problem with this in that people in surveys, when they're asked, should the auto manufacturers make a car that prioritizes the life of the pedestrian or the driver, they say, what they believe is the right answer. We want the auto manufacturers to prioritize the life of the pedestrian. But when asked what car they would buy, they want to buy a car that prioritizes the life of the driver. Now, I'm not sure they know who's going to make that car, but this is the dilemma that we have, let alone getting into the questions of, well, what if it's a teenager versus a 70-year-old and all of those different combinations. But there are some other things. As robots and robotics advance and we get more and more intelligence into these robots, when do they start to have rights? We put them in danger. We send them out to deactivate mines or to search in buildings that are collapsing. Is it right for us to make that decision for them? And what about something more mundane? Nobody likes ironing shirts. Is it wrong to program a robot to enjoy ironing shirts? You're forcing an emotion on a being. When does that being rise to the level that they have rights? And then, of course, there's abuse. Things like hacking, misinformation, ransomware. These are intentionally malicious acts. Many of the others are not necessarily intentionally malicious. So the result is we suffer consistently from unintended consequences of technology because we don't see what impact. We don't understand the way our technology can be misused. But in many cases, unfortunately, we also suffer inconsistently. As I mentioned before, so very often the benefits accrue to one group and the costs accrue to another group. And that second group often does not have the resources available to deal with those costs. And so those consequences actually impact, the costs impact more on the groups least likely or least able to respond. So I want to give some examples of technology advances that have had positive consequences, but also negative consequences. Think, for example, of the invention of paper. The revolution in education and bringing up the population and establishing rights are tremendous, but yet it also resulted in significant deforestation. Plastics have made many, many things possible, but you just have to look at the pictures of those big rafts of plastic waste in our oceans to realize the amount of pollution that comes from this, let alone pollution that is also released, say, when plastics are burned in burn pits. The internal combustion engine was a real driver for the Industrial Revolution, brought many people out of poverty, but resulted in severe negative consequences for health outcomes because of air quality. So, was this really hostile tech? And my contention here is that tech does not have to be malicious or intentionally harmful for it to be considered hostile. Yes, ransomware, malware, deep fakes, deliberate misinformation, those are all very deliberate acts of hostility. But take, for example, something simple. I was having a discussion with a person in marketing, and one of their comments was, no one minds being tracked if the recommendations that they get are good enough. And I said, I normally have problems with absolute statements like that. But I know many people, they don't care how good the recommendations are. They don't care what value might accrue to them as a result of being tracked. They just don't want to be tracked. And they consider tracking to be a hostile act. They consider this aggregation of information from all of these different places to be a hostile act, even if the intent of putting that information together is not in and of itself hostile. So why is this important now? Tech's ability to influence and impact society has been with us for a long time. But I think there are a couple of reasons why it's particularly relevant now. And the first thing is the increased complexity and increased interconnectedness of the world, our technology solutions, our information providers, makes the consequences even harder to predict. Things are changing so rapidly. Connections are being made so quickly. Our available data is growing so quickly. All of these things decrease our ability to really understand what are the consequences going to be of a particular technology. The more interconnected a system is, the more you have the potential for it to slip into chaos, for things to start interacting in ways that we never even thought of. And that's even taking deliberate misuse out of the equation. The other thing to take into account is the footprint of where technology is impacting our lives. When I started in this business, basically people were just automating manual processes for things like accounts payable and bookkeeping and things of that nature. And you could look at those enhancements as true positives for efficiency and to some extent even the quality of life, because many of those processes that people were doing were very meticulous and very exacting tasks. Exactly the kind of thing that a computer is good for. And when you fast forward, when people started trying to pull data from various mailing lists and sending out flyers into the mail, Well, it wasted a lot of paper, killed a lot of trees, but it really didn't impact me that much the day I got in the same batch of mail something that was a catalog for families with new small children and a brochure introducing me to the American Association for Retired Persons. Somehow, in whatever data these firms were collecting, they both got the idea that I was over 60 years old and that I had just started a family and had small children. Actually, neither of those things were true, but I wasn't really hurt by that. But now we have recommendation engines that are recommending chemotherapy treatments for cancer patients, that are recommending sentences for people convicted of a crime, or recommending whether or not somebody should be eligible for parole to get out of prison, or recommending whether or not people are eligible for a loan or should be hired for a job. There was a very high-profile story a couple of years ago when Amazon was trying to automate the processing of resumes to filter resumes for technology jobs. And they had to abandon it because they could not figure out a way to get that algorithm to not discriminate against women and other minorities. Every time they trained the model, every time they tweaked the model, they kept getting an incredibly biased result. If they had stuck with that, or if they hadn't really looked at the results there, that would have discriminated against all kinds of people and limited their ability to get a very good job. Another example that I like to cite, because so often when we start to talk about things like bias in models, people automatically think it's malicious, that it's intentional, that there are bad people. But here's another example. At a training hospital in the United States, we're trying to develop a model to predict when people should go into intensive care after a particular procedure. And they used two different training methods. One gave excellent results, but it was very difficult to understand the basis on which the recommendations were being made. The second model, trained on the same data set, didn't do quite as good of a job, but it was much easier to see the rationale for the recommendation that was being made. And when they interrogated that second model, what they noticed was that, in fact, they had nothing in there about patients with asthma, because their protocol had always been to automatically put all asthmatics into intensive care. And so none of those records were in the training data set. Well, people would have died if they hadn't interrogated that model. And it's not that the researchers were prejudiced against people with asthma. It's that they didn't understand, as I mentioned before, the system under which that data set was created. And so when they went back and added to the data set all of these patients with asthma that had been directed to the intensive care unit, it resulted in a model that properly took that into account. So this is not just whether or not I have more recycling because I'm getting things in the mail that are poor recommendations, or Amazon shows me something on my page that I'm not interested in. These are life and death choices and decisions that are being made. And so with that increased footprint, we need to take into account what are the consequences of the technology that we are delivering. So I've painted in some ways a pretty bleak picture. Things are more complicated. The consequences are worse. The speed at which we have to decide things is increasing. We can't know everything. We can't predict everything, but we still need to try. We still need to do something to help at least anticipate some of the consequences of the technology that we are deploying. And so, how do we fix it? And this is where this whole idea of responsible tech comes in. Now, I've heard discussions, should this be responsible tech? Should this be ethical tech? I don't really care about that distinction. What I care about is that as technologists, we begin to put in the intentional effort that says, these are the questions I need to be asking. These are the people that I need to have in view. Effectively, what we have to do is get out of our own heads. Now, our whole reason for getting into technology for many of us is we are excited at the potential of what technology can do to solve the world's problems. And we're problem solvers at heart. And so we look at a problem and here's a problem and here's the group of people who are being currently impacted by this problem and here's my technology solution. And we've got this laser focus. But what we often don't do is lift up our heads and turn it from side to side and see, okay, actually, this group is being impacted by this as well. Or perhaps this group might also be able to benefit from my solution. But we get so laser focused, and I think this is really where Mark Andreessen's observation comes from. We are so focused on how we are going to use this technology to solve a particular problem in a particular way that we really don't stop to think about how might somebody with malicious intent misuse my technology? How might somebody use this technology, use this solution, but have it have impacts that I haven't anticipated yet? Possibly good, possibly bad. Very often, these blind spots come from the fact that we're bringing our own context to solving the problem. One story I heard about when I was on my sabbatical in Kampala, Uganda, in Africa. A non-governmental organization, an NGO, was installing pipes, water pipes, to bring water from far off wells into city centers. And there was one particular village that they had built this pipe, and yet it kept getting sabotaged. And they couldn't figure out, why would somebody be sabotaging the water pipe? This is such a great thing. The women in the village previously had to walk a mile to the well, get water, and walk back every single day. Why in the world would people not want that? But what they hadn't done is they hadn't talked to the people in the village, to the women. And when somebody finally decided, well, maybe let's ask them, what they found out is that the social mores of that particular village were such that the only exposure the women in the village got to anybody else other than their family was on that 1 mile walk to the well and back. They got to interact with the other women in the village. They got to learn more about what was happening. It was a major social activity for them to go and get the water. And that was completely disrupted. And so rather than solving a problem, and arguably the NGO did solve the problem of people having to walk to the well, the costs to the women far outweighed what they saw as the benefit to them of having that water brought into the village. And so they removed the pipe. And so what we need to do is not just understand our own context, but understand the context of the people who are impacted by the first order effects of our solutions, but also the second order effects. So some of the questions that we need to ask: how will this technology affect our business? How will it affect the industry? But how also will it affect the people and the communities that help us source and manufacture this? What about where the raw materials are coming from? There are all kinds of discussions now around the impacts that are coming with the increased emphasis on electric vehicles and all of the technology, and in particular all of the lithium that currently is required for those batteries. What about the ecologies of our suppliers and our manufacturers? Are they playing nicely with the communities around them? How will this affect the people who use our technology? And how is it going to affect people who are impacted by the technology, even if they're not using it directly, or even if they're not our intended audience? Because we might intend something to be used by a particular group of people in a particular way, but that doesn't mean it's not going to be used by others. There are a lot of discussions at the moment, for example, around the impact of Instagram on teenagers and teenage girls in particular, and their self-image. Instagram didn't set out to destroy the self-image of teenage girls. But this is an unintended consequence of people actually, to some extent, using the technology as it was designed, but perhaps not in the way specifically that it was intended. Because that second order effect was now everybody looks out and, people are always happy and people are always socially active and they're having fun in all of these different ways. And most people's lives aren't like that all of the time. Another set of questions: can we broaden our impact by considering other target audiences? There's an excellent pacemaker that only fits in male chests. It's too big in general to be implanted in a woman. And when somebody raised that with the manufacturer, that said, that's all right, we're happy with where we're positioned in the market. And so all of these questions, what they're trying to get at are two fundamental questions. How can we mitigate against unintended bad outcomes? Can we start to anticipate how somebody might use our technology maliciously? But also, how can we exploit any unintended good consequences? Perhaps there's a second order use that we didn't even think about. And maybe if we spent more time understanding how our technology is going to impact the society around, we might actually spot opportunities. It's very important for us to realize that good unintended consequences are also possible. We do become laser focused, and sometimes what we miss are the negative consequences. But we can also miss positive consequences. And so we have the opportunity to lift our heads out and start to see a broader sense of impact. But how in the world do we actually do that? If we're no good at predicting the consequences of our technology, if we're always bringing our perspective into the problem solving, what are some things we can do? One obvious place to start is let's consider bringing more diverse inputs in. Maybe having a more diverse team. But that's not enough, particularly when we take into account problems of intersectionality. We can't have every possible combination of every possible demographic represented on our teams. We'd never get anything done. And we don't have to look too far to see where intersectionality is in fact a problem. We can see this, for example, in image recognition. Image recognition for African American women is worse than most other groups when you look at a US database. But if you analyze the data just for blacks and just for women, the biases don't arise. It's only when you look at that intersectionality of black women that you see the distortion. But many of our systems, at least in the United States, are not set up to take into account problems of intersectionality. And so that's a reason why, regardless of how I feel about diversity, thinking about a diverse team is not going to be sufficient to solve this problem, because we can't account through diversity for all of the various intersectionalities that might be important. And that's where the Responsible Tech Playbook comes in. We've collected a group of techniques. We've created some of them ourselves, but most of them are actually licensed from other groups. And these tools help us do things like uncover sources of bias. They help us start to think about the range of stakeholders that we have when we think about a problem. It's not just the group of people that we think we're solving the problem for. The stakeholder group is much broader than that. There are tools in there that will help us understand what are the things that matter to those various stakeholders, and tools that help us mitigate the risk of some of these challenges that I mentioned earlier. So I want to spend a few minutes talking about a selection of these techniques to give you a sense of how we can start to, as technologists, lift our head up and look at the problems more holistically. The first thing I want to talk about is a technique called Agile threat modeling. And as I said, one of the things that we are particularly bad at is accepting the reality that once we put a technology solution out in the world, people are not necessarily just going to use it the way we want them to. I had a friend actually several years ago who was working on a particular artificial intelligence approach to solve a problem in computational medicine. And he very boldly asserted that no technology that he ever worked on would ever be used by the military. And I laughed at him, because as soon as he put that model out in the world, the military was going to look at it and decide whether or not it was useful to them. That's what corporations do. That's what governments do. That's what bad actors do. is they take a look at all of the things that are out there and say, how can I use this for my purposes as opposed to the purposes for which it was created? What Agile threat modeling does, it takes inspiration from Agile software development and applies it to the process of threat modeling. But essentially what this is about is you want to look at the various assets that you have under your control and what value those assets might have to a bad actor. And what are the mechanisms that those bad actors might use to access those assets and appropriate them or misappropriate them for their own purposes. And once you've identified the assets of value and those vectors to exploit those assets, you can then start to prioritize them and say, okay, this is a pretty valuable asset and it's actually relatively easy to exploit. So let's do something explicit to close off that vector. And so you're building effectively a threat model that says, this is what is happening with my system. These are the things that could go wrong. These are the things that could be misappropriated. And now I'm going to prioritize those particular threat vectors and decide which ones I'm going to actively mitigate against. Now, this particular technique is far more suited to mitigating against negative consequences than identifying positive consequences. Because what we're really trying to do here is think of all of the different ways this could be misused. This is an iterative process. So you go through, you prioritize one set of vectors and assets, but you want to continue to revisit this model, particularly as you start to learn more about how people are actually using your product. Very, very often when we think about a threat model, people think this is something you just do at the beginning. But particularly if you're in a more traditional lean product development, test and learn cycle, you're going to be learning from the people who are using your product how it's actually being used. And so you want to reincorporate that information back into your threat model because now you know more about how this is being used. And there may be additional vectors that you want to close off. The second technique is called the tarot cards of tech. And for those of you who are not familiar with tarot cards, they're used to predict how things are going to come out. And each card has a particular meaning to a person who knows how to read tarot cards. But what these tarot cards of tech do is slightly different. It's still a set of cards, but they are provocative cards that help uncover unintended consequences by having people play a particular role. Okay, I'm a hacker going after information, or I'm a competitor. And you use these cards, you draw a card, and then you have a discussion of what does the system look like from this persona. So there's a sense of role playing in here as well, where you try to get somebody else's perspective inside your head and start to look at the problem from that perspective instead of your own. And by going through this exercise, you can get a range of perspectives in looking at how does this technology and this problem and this intended audience, how do those things intersect? and how might they go wrong? Tarot cards of tech are more likely, though, than the Agile threat model to allow us to uncover opportunities and not just threats. Because you might look at this from the perspective of a different kind of customer and start to see a potential market that you hadn't thought of in your original projection because you were too laser focused on that audience that you were trying to solve the problem for. So this is one of those techniques that can help uncover both positive as well as negative unintended consequences. I also want to talk some about data. The data ethics canvas. So the data ethics canvas allows us to start to look at how we manage the ethical issues around data. This comes from the Open Data Institute. It's, a publicly available canvas. It's inspired by things like the business model canvas, where it has particular boxes associated with it that encourage you to think about, okay, how do I look at this particular problem in this particular context? And it allows us to focus on how are we going to use the data? What is the primary purpose of the data? Is the data truly necessary to solve this particular problem? And what could go wrong by using this data? So at the start of the project and then throughout, you want to continually reevaluate, how is this data being used? How is this data being protected? One of the things that we had on our technology radar a while ago was a German concept, and I'm going to slaughter the pronunciation, I'm sure. So if any of you speak German, please forgive me. And I will translate it, so for the translators, don't worry about translating this directly into Spanish. But it's called Dataspartankeit. And what it means is you want to identify the smallest set of data that actually gives you the information that you need. When the big data revolution first started, everybody just collected all of the data they could, give me as much as possible. But when you do that, you now have data that you have to protect, that you might not be getting the value out of it that you want. And so by applying this principle, which says only keep the data that you really need to answer the questions that you're trying to answer, that's one aspect of being responsible about the data that you were collecting. It still means you have to protect whatever data is there. It still means you have to think about what are the possible vectors that a bad actor could use to infiltrate my system and take control of this data. But if you've reduced the data to only that you really need, it's of enough value to you that the cost of protecting it will not be something that you are unwilling to pay. So we need to focus on these two questions. Why are we collecting this data in the first place, and what do we need? What do we actually need from that data to achieve our goals? And who would be negatively impacted by the use of this data in this way? And what can we do to mitigate those consequences? So again, much like Agile threat modeling, this is going to probably result in more negative unintended consequences. and mitigating against those than positive ones. But very often, the more you think about what is the data I actually have available to me and what are the uses that it can be put to, there is still the potential for this to be a source of opportunities and not just threats. But as data becomes more and more important, we keep seeing more machine learning models. We keep seeing more and more businesses who are trying to make sense of their customers by analyzing that data. Something like this data ethics canvas is even more important. So, going back to the William Gibson quote, I think that technologies are morally neutral until we apply them. It's only when we use them for good or evil that they become good or evil. And I would modify this again slightly and say they could be both good and evil. We need to allow for the possibility that we are deploying technology and we are applying it in a way that is very clearly intended to help solve a problem in the world. But that doesn't mean that there are not bad actors that can either appropriate our technology and use it completely for their own purposes, or interact with our technology in a way that ensures their negative goals. When we think about things like misinformation, what can happen on Facebook with the bots and the amplification algorithm is one problem, but so is the existence of that misinformation in the first place. And that misinformation doesn't come from people who are trying to use this system for good. They are trying to use it for their own malicious purposes. As technologists, although we are compromised in our ability to really predict these consequences, and in fact, no one can really predict these consequences, we need to try. We need to use the tools that are available to us, and I encourage you to download the Responsible Tech Playbook. It has many more techniques than the ones that I mentioned today. And use those as you are analyzing problems. Try to lift your head up. Try not to be so focused on just the group you're looking at, just the problem that you're looking at, just the technology you're looking at. But try to look around and see what other opportunities are out there. And that's what we do to bring responsible tech into the world, even when we are in an era of hostile tech. Thank you very much for your attention. Hello, everybody. Should I start on the questions? Okay, well, I'm going to assume that you all can still hear me, and I'll start on the questions that are in the Q&A.
Hello. Oh, hi. Sorry, Rebecca. Thank you very much, Rebecca, for your presentation. We had some trouble here with the microphone. You have definitely showed us a new perspective on why it is important to switch from an hostile tech era into an era where responsible tech is the center of how we build technological solutions. Now we're going to start with the Q&A section of the lecture. Please, for the people present here today, if you have any questions, you can raise your hands and we'll give you the microphone. And for the people who are joining us through our live stream, please leave your questions in the Q&A section in the Zoom bar and we'll read them. The first question is, You mentioned that as technologists, we need to put the intentional effort to ask the right questions to adapt our solutions. But do you think people who aren't necessarily technologists can start doing something to change the reality of hostile tech to become responsible tech in a near future?
I believe that a level of technology literacy is important even for people who are not directly involved with technology. Um, I mentioned early in my talk that I've had people say, well, of course the Facebook algorithm is objective because it's an algorithm. I don't think everybody needs to be able to write code, at least not in the foreseeable future. But I do believe that people need to begin to get a level of basic literacy in what kinds of things are possible with technology. What are the implications? There was a particular situation in a courtroom in the U.S. where a judge was basically saying it doesn't matter if people have access to metadata because you can't learn anything from metadata. And the lawyers the next day came in and gave him a rundown of his own family and what they had been up to over the last week. And the judge was ready to throw them in jail for contempt of court. But he said, hey, you said yesterday you can't get any useful information out of metadata. We need more people to understand just what is possible, even with the technology that we have today. So I do think there are things that even non-technologists can do to start making themselves more aware of what are the possible impacts technology can have on them, and using their power as consumers to try to influence organizations that may be doing a good job or a poor job of being responsible from the perspective of technology.
Great. Thank you very much. I don't know if we have questions here in the audience. Yes, we have a question there.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yes. Congratulations. First, congratulations for your presentation. It was very educative. This is my questions. A lot of these things are for the future technology, but for example, I developed an undergrad thesis on data surveillance from governments, and this is only possible with the creation of data collection. And in some countries, governments are not interested in responsible technology, for example. Do you think or believe there is a way to protect society for that kind of problems? Because it's not malicious, but bring us so many problems. Thank you.
One of the issues we have in dealing with governments is the legislative process and the regulatory processes struggle to keep up with the pace of change. And there is a lot of ignorance about what is possible. I was reading some commentary about a lobbyist in the United States, and they were trying to ban some aspect of technology. And one of the researchers asked, why are you trying to ban this? And the answer from the lobbyist was, well, we don't understand it, so we just think we ought to say no. And unfortunately, that kind of attitude is not uncommon when we look at things. And so that really puts the onus on civil society to start to raise awareness about some of these issues. There is quite a movement, though, across governments to make data sets available. Kenya, for example, was one of the early countries to make most of their government data sets available so that researchers could have access to it, and it could be used by civil society to uncover problems and potentially offer solutions. But there's another avenue that is being explored, which is some efforts started by Sir Tim Berners-Lee, who invented the World Wide Web, for to support data sovereignty. Because right now, any data that Twitter has on me, Twitter owns. And any data Amazon has on me, Amazon owns, and so on, and so on, and so on. Data sovereignty would mean actually, I own my data. I own my medical data, my financial data, my transaction data. And I can make my data available to others for a specific purpose at a specific time. But of course, that's going to require a lot of support from organizations and governments to turn around that data ownership question. I'm not optimistic this is going to happen anytime soon. But what I do like is the fact that these questions are now at least being talked about. Transparency of what information do people have on me. GDPR-like regulations are propagating more broadly across more and more countries. So I think the trajectory is looking encouraging, although, as I say, I wouldn't expect this to be a problem we didn't worry about anymore for a while yet.
Thank you.
I wish I could be more optimistic.
Thank you very much. I think we have another question in the audience.
Thank you. I would like to know, according to your experience in the industry, if what is your perspective about the application of responsible tech in the industry? Do you think that it is applied yet, or there is a lot of work to do?
There is definitely work to do, but I'm encouraged by how many people have begun talking about this over the last couple of years. This is a topic that I've spoken on for about 2 years now. I've run some roundtables at conferences, and people are familiar with things like the tarot cards of tech. They've actually been using them on their projects. We're getting more inquiries about, okay, how can we actually make this work? You know, how can we use the ethical data canvas? Some organizations are putting out policy statements on, this is how I'm going to use your data, and these are the principles I'm going to apply, that actually go beyond what things like GDPR are asking for. So it is improving, but we definitely still have a very, very long way to go before it's just an accepted part of software development. It's still considered kind of a nice to have, sort of in the way security was considered a nice to have about 10 or 12 years ago, before we started getting more and more high profile data breaches, and people thought, oh, I better pay attention to security now, shouldn't I? And I see a similar kind of trajectory where there are still a lot of organizations that view this as a nice to have, but as it is more broadly adopted, and in particular as more customers, consumers, individuals start advocating for it, organizations will respond. They'll have to.
Great. Well, once again, thank you very much, Rebecca, for joining us today in our first Congress for Responsible Tech in Ecuador. We're very happy to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Okay.